Susan Miller woke up at 4:30 in the morning. Her alarm clock buzzed loudly next to her bed. She had been a flight attendant for American Airways for 15 years. Today was just another Thursday for her. She put on her neat blue uniform and pinned her silver wings to her jacket. Susan was known for following all the rules. She never broke the airline's rules, not even small ones. Susan drove to the Los Angeles airport in her small red car. The morning traffic was light. She arrived at the airport 2 hours before the flight to New York. She went through security quickly and met with the other flight attendants in the crew room. "Morning, Susan," said Paul Harris, a young flight attendant who had only worked for the airline for 2 years. "Ready for another day in the sky?" Susan nodded and sipped her coffee. "Always ready. Who's working first class with me today?" "That would be me," Paul said with a smile. "I heard we have a full flight." Susan checked the passenger list on her tablet. First class was indeed full, with 12 passengers. Most of them were regular business travelers who flew this route often. Susan liked working first class because things usually went smoothly there. The flight crew boarded the plane an hour before the passengers. Susan and Paul prepared the first class cabin, making sure everything was perfect. They checked that each seat had fresh pillows and blankets. They made sure all the menus were in place and that the entertainment systems worked. "I want everything to be perfect," Susan told Paul. "These passengers pay a lot of money for first class." When boarding time came, Susan stood at the entrance of the plane with a smile on her face. She greeted each passenger warmly as they came aboard. She helped an older woman with her bag and showed a young businessman how to use the seat controls. Most of the first-class passengers had already boarded when a tall, older man in a baseball cap and dark sunglasses walked onto the plane. He wore a simple brown jacket and jeans. He handed Susan his ticket without saying a word. Susan looked at the ticket and then checked her tablet. She frowned slightly. According to her tablet, seat 2A was already assigned to another passenger who had already boarded. She looked at the ticket again to make sure she wasn't making a mistake. "I'm sorry, sir," Susan said politely. "There seems to be a problem with this seat. The system shows seat 2A is already occupied by another passenger. Let me check with the gate agent to sort this out." The tall man removed his sunglasses. His blue eyes were sharp and clear. He had a face that was deeply lined with age, but there was something very familiar about it. Susan was too focused on the ticket problem to really look at his face carefully. "There must be some mistake," the man said in a low, gravelly voice. "My assistant booked this seat for me yesterday." Susan nodded politely. "I understand, sir. These things happen sometimes. Please wait here for a moment while I speak to the gate agent." As Susan turned to use the phone to call the gate, Paul rushed over. His eyes were wide with surprise. He pulled Susan aside, away from the older man. "Susan," Paul whispered urgently, "do you know who that is?" Susan glanced back at the man who was now putting his small bag in the overhead compartment above seat 2A. "No, who is it?" "That's Clint Eastwood," Paul said, his voice filled with excitement. "The Clint Eastwood, the famous actor and director." Susan's mouth fell open in shock. She looked again at the older man. Now that Paul had said it, she could clearly see it was indeed the legendary Hollywood star. Despite being in his 90s, he still had that commanding presence that had made him famous in countless movies. "Oh my goodness," Susan whispered. "I just told Clint Eastwood he couldn't sit in first class." "He absolutely has a first-class reservation," Paul said quickly. "There must be a mistake in the system." Susan felt her face grow hot with embarrassment. In her 15 years as a flight attendant, she had seen many celebrities, but she had never made a mistake like this with such a famous person. Other passengers in first class began to notice who was standing in the aisle. A man in seat 3C, Frank Bennett, looked up from his newspaper and did a double take. His eyes widened with recognition. "Excuse me," Frank called out, standing up from his seat. "Mr. Eastwood, I'm a huge fan of your work. Would it be possible to get your autograph?" A woman named Nancy Collins in seat 1B discreetly took out her phone and tried to take a photo without being too obvious. Other passengers began to whisper among themselves, pointing and staring at the Hollywood legend. Susan knew she needed to resolve the seating issue quickly. Having a celebrity standing in the aisle was causing a disruption to the boarding process. Passengers in economy class were starting to back up in the aisle behind Mr. Eastwood. Just then, the captain of the flight, John Peters, emerged from the cockpit. He had been informed by another crew member about the famous passenger and the seating problem. Captain Peters was a tall man with gray hair and a friendly smile. He had been flying for over 20 years and had seen all kinds of situations, but even he seemed a bit starstruck. "Mr. Eastwood," Captain Peters said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to have you on our flight today. I'm Captain John Peters. We'll sort out this seating situation right away." Clint Eastwood shook the captain's hand firmly. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate it." Susan was still feeling mortified about the mistake. She prided herself on her professionalism and attention to detail. Now she had embarrassed herself in front of not only a Hollywood legend but also her fellow crew members and the other first-class passengers. While Captain Peters spoke with Mr. Eastwood, Susan quickly used the phone to call the gate agent. "Linda, we have a situation here. We have Clint Eastwood on board, but there seems to be a problem with his seat assignment." Linda Washington, the gate agent, sounded surprised on the other end of the line. "Clint Eastwood, let me check the system immediately." While they waited for Linda to check the booking system, more passengers continued to board. The economy cabin was filling up and people were slowing down as they passed through first class, trying to get a glimpse of the famous actor. Susan noticed that Mr. Eastwood was handling the situation with remarkable patience. Unlike some celebrities she had encountered over the years who demanded special treatment, he stood quietly, occasionally nodding politely to passengers who recognized him. After what seemed like an eternity, but was really only a few minutes, Linda rushed onto the plane with a printout in her hand. "I've found the problem," Linda said, slightly out of breath from hurrying down the jetway. Mr. Eastwood was indeed booked in seat 2A through a special arrangement with our VIP service. However, there was a glitch in our system, and the same seat was also assigned to another passenger, Mr. Kevin Wright. Susan looked over at seat 2A, where a young man in a business suit was sitting, typing on his laptop. He seemed completely unaware of the situation unfolding around him. Linda approached Kevin Wright and explained the situation quietly. When Kevin realized who he was inadvertently sharing a seat assignment with, his eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Eastwood," Kevin said, standing up quickly. "I'm so sorry about this mix-up. Please, take this seat. It would be my honor. I can move to another seat." Linda checked her tablet. "We do have one more available seat in first class 4B. Would that be acceptable, Mr. Wright?" Kevin nodded eagerly. "Absolutely, no problem at all." As Kevin gathered his belongings to move to the other seat, Susan approached Mr. Eastwood, her heart pounding with nervousness. "Mr. Eastwood," she said quietly, "I'm terribly sorry for the confusion. I was just following our procedures without realizing who you were. Please accept my apology." The famous actor looked at her with those intense blue eyes that had captivated movie audiences for decades. Susan braced herself for an angry response or at least a cold dismissal. Susan stood frozen, waiting for Clint Eastwood's response to her apology. The famous actor looked at her with those piercing blue eyes. Then, to her surprise, his expression softened. A small smile appeared on his weathered face. "You were just doing your job," he said in that familiar, gravelly voice that had delivered so many famous movie lines. "No need to apologize for that." Susan felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had expected anger or at least irritation from the Hollywood legend. Instead, he was being understanding and kind. "Thank you for understanding, Mr. Eastwood," Susan said. "Please let me know if you need anything during the flight." As Clint Eastwood settled into his seat, Paul came over to Susan with wide eyes. "What did he say to you?" Paul whispered excitedly. "He was very nice about it," Susan replied. "He said I was just doing my job." Paul nodded. "That's what I've heard about him. People say he's very professional and respectful to everyone on his movie sets, too." The rest of the boarding process continued smoothly. Susan tried to act normal, but she couldn't help feeling embarrassed about the mix-up. She noticed that many passengers in economy class were slowing down as they walked past first class, trying to get a glimpse of the famous actor. Once all passengers were seated, Susan began the standard safety demonstration. She found it hard to focus with Clint Eastwood sitting right there in seat 2A, watching her. Her hands shook slightly as she showed how to fasten the seatbelt and where to find the life vest. After the safety demonstration, the plane taxied to the runway. Susan took her jump seat for takeoff, sitting directly across from where Mr. Eastwood was seated. She tried not to stare at him, but it was difficult not to look at such a famous face. The plane took off smoothly and climbed into the clear blue sky above Los Angeles. Once they reached cruising altitude, Susan and Paul began the first-class drink service. "What would you like to drink, Mr. Eastwood?" Susan asked when she reached his seat. "Just black coffee, please," he replied simply. Susan noticed that unlike many celebrities she had served over the years, Clint Eastwood didn't make any special requests or demands. He was polite and straightforward. As Susan poured his coffee, the plane hit a small patch of turbulence. The coffee splashed slightly, a few drops landing on the serving tray. Susan quickly wiped it up with a napkin. "I'm so sorry about that," she said. "No harm done," Mr. Eastwood replied. Then he added with a small smile, "I've faced worse than spilled coffee in my time." Susan smiled back, beginning to feel more at ease. She continued serving the other first-class passengers, but she couldn't help noticing how many of them were sneaking glances at the famous actor. Frank Bennett, the businessman who had asked for an autograph earlier, was still trying to work up the courage to approach Mr. Eastwood again. Nancy Collins kept pretending to take selfies, but she was actually trying to get photos of the actor in the background. Kevin Wright, the young man who had given up his seat, seemed to be the most respectful. He nodded politely to Mr. Eastwood when their eyes met but didn't try to bother him. After the drink service, Paul pulled Susan aside near the galley. "This is so exciting," Paul whispered. "Clint Eastwood on our flight. I grew up watching his movies with my dad. Dirty Harry was my dad's favorite." "I know," Susan said. "It's pretty amazing. But we need to treat him just like any other passenger. He seems to appreciate being treated normally." Paul nodded, but his eyes were still bright with excitement. "I wonder if I could get a photo with him after we land. Do you think that would be okay?" Before Susan could answer, the call button from seat 5A in first class lit up. It was Greg Phillips, a wealthy businessman who flew frequently and was known among the flight crew for being demanding. Susan went to his seat. "Yes, Mr. Phillips. How can I help you?" Greg looked annoyed. "I asked for sparkling water, not still water. And why is everyone making such a fuss over there?" He nodded toward where Clint Eastwood was sitting. "I'm very sorry about the water, Mr. Phillips. I'll get you sparkling water right away," Susan said politely. She chose not to answer his question about the other passengers. As Susan went to get the sparkling water, she noticed that Greg was craning his neck, trying to see who was getting all the attention. When she returned with his drink, he stopped her again. "Is that Clint Eastwood?" he asked loudly, not bothering to lower his voice. "Yes, sir," Susan replied quietly. "It is." Greg's face lit up with a mixture of surprise and something else. Perhaps jealousy or competitiveness. Susan had seen this reaction before from wealthy passengers when they encountered celebrities. Some seemed to feel that they deserved the same level of attention. "Well, I spend thousands of dollars flying with this airline every month," Greg said, his voice getting even louder. "I should be getting at least as much attention as some old actor." Susan felt her face grow hot. She was embarrassed for Greg and worried that Mr. Eastwood might hear these rude comments. "Sir, we treat all our first-class passengers with the same level of service," Susan assured him quietly. "Can I get you anything else right now?" "You can tell me why his coffee was served before my water," Greg said, his voice now loud enough that several nearby passengers turned to look. Susan knew this wasn't true. She had served drinks row by row, starting from the front, but she didn't want to argue. "I apologize if you felt there was any delay in your service, Mr. Phillips. We always aim to serve all our passengers promptly." Greg wasn't satisfied. "I've been flying first class for 20 years and I know when I'm not getting the proper treatment. Is it because I'm not famous? Because I don't make movies? By now, everyone in first class could hear him. Some passengers looked uncomfortable, while others seemed annoyed by the disruption. Susan noticed that Clint Eastwood had put on reading glasses and was looking at a script, seemingly ignoring the commotion. Captain Peters had come out of the cockpit to use the lavatory and overheard the last part of Greg's complaints. He approached Susan. "Is everything all right here?" he asked quietly. Before Susan could answer, Greg spoke up. "No, everything is not all right. I'm being treated like a second-class citizen in first class." Captain Peters gave Greg a steady look. "Sir, I can assure you that our crew treats all passengers with equal respect and courtesy." "Then why is everyone fawning over him?" Greg pointed toward Clint Eastwood, who was still focused on his script. The captain looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Phillips, please lower your voice. All passengers deserve to have a peaceful flight." Greg wasn't backing down. "I pay good money for these seats. I deserve respect." Susan noticed that several passengers were now openly staring at the scene. She felt terrible that this was happening on her flight. She had always prided herself on providing a smooth, pleasant experience, especially in first class. Paul appeared at Susan's side looking worried. "Is there anything I can do to help?" he whispered. Susan was about to answer when she noticed movement from seat 2A. Clint Eastwood had closed his script and removed his reading glasses. He stood up slowly, his tall frame straightening to full height. The cabin went suddenly quiet, as the legendary actor turned and looked directly at Greg Phillips. He didn't say anything at first, just fixed Greg with the same intense gaze that had intimidated countless villains on the big screen. Susan held her breath. What would happen next? Would this situation escalate into something even worse? She had never had to deal with a confrontation between a rude passenger and a Hollywood legend before. Captain Peters seemed unsure what to do. He looked at Susan with raised eyebrows, silently asking if she wanted him to intervene. But before she could respond, Clint Eastwood began walking slowly toward Greg's seat. The entire first-class cabin watched in silence as the famous actor approached the businessman. Greg's angry expression faltered slightly as Eastwood came closer. For all his complaints about wanting to be treated like a celebrity, Greg now seemed intimidated by actually facing one. Susan wondered if she should step in, but something told her to wait. There was no aggression in Mr. Eastwood's movements, just a calm, deliberate purpose. He stopped next to Greg's seat and looked down at him. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his previous confidence evaporating under Eastwood's steady gaze. The silence stretched for what seemed like a very long time, but was probably only a few seconds. Everyone in first class watched as Clint Eastwood stood over Greg Phillips. The famous actor didn't raise his voice or make any threatening moves. He simply looked at Greg with calm, steady eyes. "The lady is doing her job professionally," Eastwood said in his quiet, gravelly voice. "You might want to reconsider your attitude." Those simple words, delivered in the same tone that had made movie villains tremble, had an immediate effect on Greg. His face turned red, and he looked down at his lap. I was just..." Greg stammered, unable to finish his sentence. Clint Eastwood didn't wait for him to find his words. He simply nodded once, turned around, and walked back to his seat. He sat down and picked up his script again, as if nothing unusual had happened. The first-class cabin remained silent for several seconds. Susan wasn't sure what to do. She had never seen a passenger situation resolved quite like this before. Finally, she approached Greg's seat. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Phillips?" she asked politely. Greg shook his head, still looking embarrassed. "No, thank you, I'm fine." Susan nodded and returned to the galley where Paul was waiting with wide eyes. "That was amazing," Paul whispered. He didn't even have to say much. Just a few words and that look. "I know," Susan replied. "I've never seen anything like it." Captain Peters, who had witnessed the whole scene, gave Susan a relieved smile before returning to the cockpit. The tension in the first-class cabin had completely disappeared. The other passengers went back to their books, movies, or laptops, though many still sneaked glances at Clint Eastwood. For the next hour, the flight continued smoothly. Susan served lunch to the first-class passengers. When she reached Clint Eastwood's seat, she felt much more relaxed than earlier. "What would you like for lunch, Mr. Eastwood?" "We have chicken with rice or pasta with vegetables," she said. "The chicken sounds good," he replied. Then he added, "Thank you for handling everything so professionally today." Susan felt a warm glow of pride at his words. "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood. That means a lot coming from you." As she served his meal, Susan couldn't help but notice that Mr. Eastwood seemed to be traveling alone. Most celebrities she had encountered flew with assistants or security personnel, but the famous actor was by himself, simply reading his script and enjoying his flight like a regular passenger. When she finished serving lunch to all the first-class passengers, Susan took a moment to check on Greg Phillips. He was eating quietly and seemed much more subdued than before. "Is everything okay with your meal, Mr. Phillips?" Susan asked. Greg nodded. "Yes, it's fine. Thank you." He paused, then added in a low voice, "I apologize for my behavior earlier. It was inappropriate." Susan was surprised but pleased by his apology. "Thank you, Mr. Phillips. I appreciate that." As Susan turned to go, Greg stopped her with another question. "Has he always been like that? So commanding without even trying?" Susan smiled. "I wouldn't know. This is my first time meeting him, too." After lunch, the flight hit some turbulence as they flew over the Rocky Mountains. The seatbelt sign came on, and Susan asked all passengers to return to their seats. The plane bounced and shook as it passed through rough air. Susan noticed that a young woman in seat 4C looked very nervous. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the armrests, and her face was pale. The woman who had introduced herself earlier as Beth Jones was a college student flying home to visit her family. Susan approached her seat. "Are you okay, Miss Jones? Can I get you some water?" Beth nodded shakily. "Yes, please, I hate turbulence, it really scares me." Susan brought her a cup of water, but the plane hit another bump, causing some of the water to spill. Beth let out a small cry of fear. "I'm sorry," Beth said, her voice trembling. "I know it's silly to be so afraid." "It's not silly at all," Susan assured her. Many people feel anxious during turbulence. Susan wished she could stay and comfort Beth, but she needed to check on the other passengers and make sure everything was secure. As she moved away, she was surprised to see Clint Eastwood unfasten his seatbelt and stand up, despite the seatbelt sign being on. He made his way carefully down the aisle, holding onto the seats for balance as the plane continued to bounce. He stopped next to Beth's seat. "Mind if I sit here for a minute?" he asked, pointing to the empty seat beside her. Beth's eyes widened in recognition and surprise. "No. Yes. Please, sit down." Clint Eastwood sat beside the young woman. Susan watched from the galley, curious about what would happen next. "First time flying?" Eastwood asked Beth. She shook her head. "No, but I never get used to the turbulence. It always makes me think something terrible is going to happen." Eastwood nodded understandingly. "I've been flying for over 70 years now. Started back when planes were a lot smaller and bounced around a lot more than this." Beth looked at him with interest, momentarily distracted from her fear. "Really? That must have been scary." "It was," Eastwood admitted. "But here's something that helps me. Think of it like driving on a bumpy road. The car bounces around, but it's not dangerous, just uncomfortable." As he spoke, the plane hit another patch of rough air. Beth gasped and grabbed the armrest again. "When I was filming movies in Africa in the 1960s, Eastwood continued, his calm voice drawing Beth's attention back to him, "we flew in small planes that felt like they were made of paper. The pilots would laugh at the turbulence that had the rest of us white-knuckled." Beth smiled weakly. "And you were scared too?" "Everyone gets scared sometimes," Eastwood said. "The trick is not letting the fear take over." Susan was amazed to see the legendary tough guy actor sitting there, calmly talking to a frightened young woman. It was so different from his screen persona, yet somehow exactly what she would have expected from the real man behind the characters. The conversation between Beth and Clint Eastwood continued for several minutes. He told her stories about filming in remote locations around the world and the many flights he had taken during his long career. With each story, Beth seemed to relax a little more, even though the turbulence continued. Susan had to continue her duties, checking on other passengers and securing items in the galley. But she kept glancing back at the unlikely pair. She noticed that other passengers were watching too, many of them smiling at the touching scene. After about 15 minutes, the turbulence finally subsided, and the captain turned off the seatbelt sign. Clint Eastwood stood up to return to his seat. "Thank you," Beth said, looking much calmer now. "That really helped. I didn't even notice the last few bumps." Eastwood gave her a small smile. "Good, that's the idea." He walked back to his seat, acknowledging the grateful nods from other passengers who had seen his kindness. Susan approached him as he settled back into seat 2A. "That was very kind of you, Mr. Eastwood." Miss Jones was really struggling with her fear. "Sometimes all people need is a distraction," he replied simply. As the flight continued eastward, Susan found herself looking at Clint Eastwood with new eyes. The day had started with her accidentally trying to remove him from his rightful seat in first class. Now, just a few hours later, she had seen him stand up to a rude passenger and comfort a frightened young woman, all with the same quiet dignity. "When do you?" Susan served pre-landing beverages. She made sure to bring Clint Eastwood his black coffee without him having to ask. He thanked her with a nod and returned to reading his script. The plane began its descent into New York. Susan and Paul prepared the cabin for landing, collecting trash and making sure all seats were upright. As they worked, Paul whispered to, Susan, "This has been the most interesting flight of my career," he said. "Wait until the other flight attendants hear about this." Susan smiled. "It's certainly a day I won't forget." The captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their approach to New York and thanking everyone for flying with American Airways. As the plane descended through the clouds, Susan noticed that Beth Jones looked much more relaxed now. Greg Phillips sat quietly, showing none of his earlier arrogance. And Clint Eastwood simply gazed out the window, watching the New York skyline come into view. A living legend who had shown that the best kind of strength wasn't about intimidation or aggression, but about using your power to help others. The plane touched down smoothly at JFK Airport in New York. Susan made the standard announcement thanking passengers for flying with American Airways. As the plane taxied to the gate, she noticed many passengers in first class were gathering their things quickly, probably hoping to exit at the same time as Clint Eastwood. Susan smiled to herself. She had seen this behavior before with other celebrities. Everyone wanted that last chance to get close to someone famous, maybe get a photo or an autograph, or just a story to tell their friends. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York," Susan announced once the plane had stopped at the gate. "Please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened until the captain turns off the seatbelt sign. We'll begin deplaning shortly." When the seatbelt sign went off, passengers immediately stood up and began retrieving their bags from the overhead compartments. Susan stood near the front of the plane, ready to say goodbye to the passengers as they left. To her surprise, Clint Eastwood remained seated, letting other passengers go ahead of him. This was unusual for first-class passengers, especially celebrities, who typically wanted to exit the plane as quickly as possible. As the aisle cleared, Susan approached Mr. Eastwood. "Can I help you with anything, sir?" He shook his head. "No, thank you. I just prefer to avoid the crowds. My driver isn't meeting me for another 30 minutes anyway." Susan nodded understandingly. "Of course, take your time." Most of the first-class passengers had deplaned now. Beth Jones, the young woman who had been afraid of turbulence, paused as she passed Clint Eastwood's seat. "Thank you again for your kindness earlier," she said shyly. "My friends will never believe I sat next to Clint Eastwood on my flight." He smiled at her. "You're welcome. Safe travels." Beth beamed and continued down the aisle. Even Greg Phillips, the rude businessman, nodded respectfully to Eastwood as he left the plane. Soon, all the first-class passengers had deplaned, and economy passengers were filing past. Many of them slowed down when they spotted the famous actor, their eyes widening in recognition. Some pulled out their phones trying to take discreet photos. Others simply stared as they walked by. Susan and Paul stood at their positions, directing passengers and helping with bags when needed. Susan noticed that Mr. Eastwood seemed unbothered by the attention. He had taken out a small notebook and was writing something, occasionally glancing out the window at the busy airport. After about 10 minutes, most of the passengers had left the plane. Only a few stragglers remained in economy class. Captain Peters emerged from the cockpit ready to leave. When he saw that Clint Eastwood was still on board, he approached him. "Mr. Eastwood, it was an honor having you on our flight today," the captain said, extending his hand. Eastwood stood up and shook the captain's hand. "Thank you, it was a good flight. You handled that turbulence well." Captain Peters beamed at the compliment. "That's very kind of you to say. Are you staying in New York long?" "Just a few days," Eastwood replied. "I'm meeting with some producers about a new film project." Susan couldn't help overhearing their conversation as she completed her post-flight duties. She was surprised to learn that even at his advanced age, Clint Eastwood was still working on new movies. After the captain left, Clint Eastwood finally stood up and took his small carry-on bag from the overhead compartment. Susan noticed that, despite his age, he moved with the same purposeful grace that had characterized his screen performances for decades. As he prepared to leave, he turned to Susan. "I appreciate your professionalism today," he said. "It's not easy dealing with difficult situations at 35,000 feet." Susan smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood. That means a lot coming from you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a small piece of paper. "I'd like you to have this," he said, handing it to her. Susan looked down at what he had given her. It was a note written on hotel stationery. It read, "For Susan, thanks for your professionalism and dedication to doing things right. The world needs more people who stand by their principles." It was signed simply Clint Eastwood with a small sketch of a cowboy hat. Susan was speechless for a moment. In her 15 years as a flight attendant, she had never received such a thoughtful note from a passenger, let alone a Hollywood legend. "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood," she finally managed to say. "I'll treasure this." He nodded and then made his way to the exit. Paul, who had been helping the last economy passengers, rushed over to say goodbye to the famous actor. "Mr. Eastwood, it was an honor to serve you today," Paul said enthusiastically. "I'm a huge fan of your films." Clint Eastwood shook Paul's hand. "Thank you for your good work today," he said simply. As Eastwood walked down the jetway into the terminal, Paul turned to Susan with wide eyes. "Did you get his autograph?" he asked eagerly. Susan showed him the note. "Even better, he wrote me a personal note." Paul read it and looked impressed. "Wow, that's amazing. And he seems like such a genuine person. Not at all what you might expect from someone so famous." Susan nodded. "I know. It's been quite a day." After Clint Eastwood left, Susan and Paul completed their post-flight duties. They cleaned the cabin, counted the unused items, and filed their flight reports. Throughout it all, Susan kept thinking about the day's events and the unexpected encounters with the Hollywood legend. When they finished their work, Susan and Paul left the plane together and headed to the crew lounge in the airport. Other flight attendants were there, resting between flights or waiting to go home. Carly, another flight attendant, looked up as they entered. "Hey, you two. How was the LA to New York route today?" Paul couldn't contain his excitement. "You won't believe who was on our flight. Clint Eastwood." The lounge immediately buzzed with interest. Flight attendants gathered around, eager to hear details. "Clint Eastwood, the actor?" Carly asked, eyes wide. "What was he like?" Susan smiled. "He was, not what you might expect. Very down-to-earth and kind." Paul jumped in. Susan tried to kick him out of first class. Everyone turned to Susan with shocked expressions. She felt her face flush with embarrassment. "It wasn't like that," she explained. "There was a mix-up with the seat assignments. I didn't recognize him at first. And then," Paul continued excitedly, "this rude passenger started making a scene, and Clint Eastwood shut him down with just a few words. It was just like in his movies." The other flight attendants listened eagerly as Paul described the day's events, occasionally exaggerating for dramatic effect. Susan let him tell most of the story, only jumping in to correct his more outlandish claims. He also helped a young woman who was scared of turbulence, Susan added when Paul finally paused for breath. He sat with her and told her stories until she calmed down. And he gave Susan a personal note, Paul announced. "Show them, Susan." Reluctantly, Susan took out the note and showed it to her colleagues. They passed it around, admiring the famous signature and the little cowboy hat sketch. "This is incredible," Carly said. "You should frame this." Susan nodded. "I think I will." As the crew discussed the Clint Eastwood encounter, Susan's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her supervisor, asking her to come to the office before her next flight. "I wonder what that's about," Susan said, showing the message to Paul. Paul looked worried. "You don't think it's about the seating mix-up with Mr. Eastwood, do you? Or letting him get up during turbulence?" Susan frowned. "I hope not. But I guess I'll find out tomorrow." That night, in her hotel room in New York, Susan couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the day's events, from the embarrassment of trying to remove Clint Eastwood from his seat to the pride she felt when he complimented her professionalism. She wondered what her supervisor wanted to discuss with her. Could she be in trouble? She took out the note Eastwood had given her and read it again. "Thanks for your professionalism and dedication to doing things right. The world needs more people who stand by their principles." Those words gave her comfort. Whatever happened tomorrow, she knew she had done her job to the best of her ability. And somehow, having that acknowledgement from someone like Clint Eastwood made her feel that everything would be okay. Susan finally drifted off to sleep, the note carefully placed on her bedside table. Outside her window, the New York City lights twinkled in the darkness, and somewhere in this vast city, a Hollywood legend was perhaps telling someone the story of a flight attendant who wasn't afraid to do her job correctly, even when it meant questioning Clint Eastwood. The next morning, Susan woke up early in her New York hotel room. She had a meeting with her supervisor before her return flight to Los Angeles. She was still nervous about what the meeting might be about. Had someone complained about how she handled the situation with Clint Eastwood? Or was it about letting him move seats during turbulence to help Beth? Susan put on her neat blue uniform and pinned her silver wings to her jacket. She looked at Clint Eastwood's note one more time before carefully placing it in her bag. His words gave her courage. She had done her job correctly, following the rules and treating everyone with respect. When Susan arrived at the airport, she went straight to the American Airways office. Her supervisor, Diane Brown, was waiting for her. Diane was a serious woman in her 50s who had been with the airline for over 25 years. "Good morning, Susan," Diane said, motioning for her to sit down. "Thank you for coming in early." Susan sat down, trying to hide her nervousness. "Good morning, Diane. Is everything okay?" Diane looked at Susan with an expression that was hard to read. "I received some interesting information about your flight yesterday." Susan's heart sank. "Is there a problem? Did someone complain?" To her surprise, Diane smiled. "Actually, quite the opposite. The airline received a phone call from Clint Eastwood's assistant this morning. Mr. Eastwood wanted to personally commend you for your professionalism and excellent service." Susan's eyes widened in shock. "Really? He called the airline about me?" Diane nodded. "Yes, and that's not something that happens every day. In fact, I can't remember the last time a celebrity took the time to praise one of our flight attendants specifically by name." Susan felt a wave of relief and pride wash over her. "That's very kind of him." His assistant explained how you handled a difficult seating situation and a disruptive passenger with grace and professionalism, Diane continued. "And apparently, you didn't give him any special treatment just because he's famous." Susan smiled, remembering how she had initially tried to remove him from his seat without even recognizing who he was. "Well, that's certainly true." Diane leaned forward. "But that's not the only reason I wanted to speak with you today. The story of your flight with Clint Eastwood has spread quite quickly through the airline. Several news outlets have picked up the story as well." Susan was surprised. "News outlets? How did they hear about it?" Apparently, some passengers posted about it on social media, Diane explained. There are photos of Mr. Eastwood on your flight, and people are talking about how he stood up to a rude passenger and helped a young woman who was afraid of flying. Your name has been mentioned as the flight attendant involved. Susan didn't know what to say. She had never expected any of this attention. The airline sees this as a very positive story, Diane continued. It shows our flight attendants as professional and our service as top-notch, even with high-profile passengers. We'd like to feature this story in our company newsletter with your permission. Of course, Susan said, still trying to process everything. That would be fine. Diane smiled. Excellent. There's one more thing. The director of in-flight services was very impressed when he heard about this. He'd like to offer you a position as a training supervisor for new flight attendants. You would help teach them how to handle difficult situations with the same professionalism you displayed. Susan was speechless for a moment. A position as a training supervisor was a significant promotion. It would mean better pay, more regular hours, and less time away from home. I don't know what to say. Susan finally managed. Thank you for this opportunity. I would be honored to accept. Diane stood up and extended her hand. Congratulations, Susan. You've earned this with your years of excellent service. The Clint Eastwood incident just helped shine a spotlight on it. As Susan left the office, she felt like she was walking on air. What had started as a potentially embarrassing mistake had turned into the opportunity of a lifetime. She took out her phone to call her sister and share the good news. Before she could make the call, she noticed a news alert on her phone. She clicked on it and was shocked to see a headline. Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood praises flight attendant for professionalism. The article included quotes from passengers who had been on the flight, describing how Susan had handled the seating mix-up with grace, and how Clint Eastwood had later defended her against a rude passenger. There was even a blurry photo someone had taken of Eastwood sitting next to Beth during the turbulence. Susan couldn't believe how quickly the story had spread. She scrolled through the comments on the article and was touched to see how many people were praising both her and Clint Eastwood for their actions. As Susan walked to her gate for her return flight to Los Angeles, several airport employees and even some passengers recognized her from the news story. People smiled at her, and one woman even asked for a selfie with the flight attendant Clint Eastwood defended. Susan's return flight was much less eventful than the previous day's journey. She worked economy class this time, but she found herself handling every situation with renewed confidence. The story of her encounter with Clint Eastwood had reminded her of why she loved her job, the opportunity to make a difference in people's travel experiences, whether they were famous actors or ordinary passengers. 3 months after the flight, with Clint Eastwood, Susan was fully settled into her new role as a training supervisor. She enjoyed teaching new flight attendants and sharing her experiences with them. She often used the story of her encounter with Clint Eastwood as an example of how to handle unexpected situations with professionalism. One morning, Susan arrived at the training center to find a package waiting for her. It had been delivered by courier and was marked personal and confidential. Susan opened the package carefully. Inside was a framed photo of Clint Eastwood from his movie Unforgiven. The photo was signed, "To Susan, a true professional who stands by her principles. Thank you for the reminder that doing the right thing matters. Clint Eastwood." Also in the package was a letter on official stationery from Eastwood's production company. Susan read it with growing excitement. Dear Ms. Miller, on behalf of Mr. Eastwood, I would like to extend an invitation for you to visit the set of his latest directing project, The Last Sunset, which begins filming next month in Montana. Mr. Eastwood thought you might enjoy seeing how we handle difficult situations in the film industry, just as he learned from you how professionals handle challenges at 35,000 feet. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to arrange the details of your visit. All expenses will be covered by our production company. Sincerely, Mary Johnson, Executive Assistant to Clint Eastwood. Susan could hardly believe what she was reading. An all-expenses-paid trip to visit a real Hollywood movie set at the personal invitation of Clint Eastwood himself. She immediately called the number provided in the letter and made arrangements for the visit. She would use some of her vacation days to spend a week in Montana, observing the filming and meeting the cast and crew. News of the invitation spread quickly through the airline. Susan's story became legendary among flight attendants across the country. It was used in training sessions as an example of how maintaining professionalism and following procedures correctly could lead to unexpected positive outcomes. The story of the flight attendant who tried to kick Clint Eastwood out of first class took on a life of its own. It was featured in airline magazines and even mentioned in a few Hollywood interviews with Eastwood himself. When asked about the incident in one interview, the legendary actor said simply, "I respect people who do their jobs right, even when it's not convenient for me. That's what integrity looks like." For Susan Miller, the most important lesson from the whole experience wasn't about meeting a famous actor or getting a promotion. It was the reminder that doing your job correctly and treating everyone with respect was always the right choice, even when it seemed difficult or uncomfortable in the moment. Whenever new flight attendants asked her for advice, Susan would show them the framed photo from Clint Eastwood and tell them, "Stand by your principles even when facing a legend. True professionals do what's right, not what's easy." And somewhere in Hollywood, a legendary actor and director told a similar story to young actors and film crew members. A story about a flight attendant who wasn't afraid to do her job correctly, even when it meant questioning Clint Eastwood himself.